Welcome, everybody. We're so glad to have you, and we are really honored to have Bob Gomel back in the gallery in Santa Fe with us. Just a little bit of background, if you're not familiar with Bob. He was born in 1933 and grew up in the Bronx, New York, became fascinated with photography as a young child in grade school. He remembers one of his teachers was a photographer who kept in his classroom a sepia tone print of a pigeon standing on a manhole cover on a cobblestone street. That image inspired Bob, and he saved money from his job delivering groceries to buy his first camera. He shot pictures for his high school newspaper and then in college at New York University, where he made connections with senior members of the New York Press Corps while photographing games at Madison Square Garden. After a 4-year stint in the US Navy as an aviator, he came back to the US and actually turned down a job for the Associated Press. He was deeply interested in creating magazine-style narrative journalism, and he joined Life magazine and began his journey documenting the history we now have on the walls of this exhibit. When Life ceased being a weekly in the early 1970s, Bob began making photographs for other major magazines, including Sports Illustrated, Newsweek, Fortune, Forbes, and Time, among many others. He also branched out into advertising photography and helped introduce Merrill Lynch's Bullish on America campaign. Never one to slow down, over the last several years, Bob and Sandy have traveled the world extensively, and we're so thrilled to have him here in Santa Fe. Did I do that right, Bob?
Bob, it's such an honor to have you here again with us. We've had several exhibits together, and I'm compelled to start at the sort of beginning. I wonder if you'll tell us about the portfolio that you presented to Life magazine to secure your position.
I was interested in picture magazines, of which there were 3. Life was one, Saturday Evening Post was another, and Look magazine a third. So what I was doing with my portfolio was seeing the picture editor of all 3 magazines, and they were encouraging, and the best I could get as a commitment was keep in touch. And that wasn't so terrible, but in the process, my younger brother is 5 years my junior, who was still in college, was involved in a terrible automobile accident. Some Saturday night, he and his lady friend crashed into a tree. The lady was killed. My brother was in very bad shape. And I did what was natural for me. I was living with my mom and dad at the time, and I started recording my family in crisis. We were traveling back and forth from New York to Poughkeepsie on a daily basis, and I convinced the doctors to allow me into the operating room when they removed my brother's lung. Fortunately, my brother recovered from that, and but in the middle of that going on, it was time for my Life magazine appointment, and the only thing I had done in the past month was what I just described to you. So I brought up 10 or 12 contact sheets showing my family, and the editor at the time, a gentleman by the name of Phil Kuhnhart, said, "Sit tight, I'll be right back." And he took my contact sheets into the managing editor and came back and said, "We'll give you so much money to have first rights to see this when you complete this story." Well, I was overwhelmed because at that point, from my Navy salary, I was drawing unemployment insurance of something like $45 a week. And the offer from Life was quite wonderful and generous. But that is how it all began. It was earmarked for a story on the 4th of July to awaken people as to the dangers and hazards of automobiles and accidents and so forth. But I started getting small assignments. I was assigned to the United Nations and stuff like that. And the assignments grew larger and larger as they gained more confidence in me, and I felt more secure in what I was doing. And that was the beginning.
That's fantastic. I'm not sure most people understand how demanding a photojournalist's job is when covering a high-level subject. We've met photojournalists who've fallen asleep in cars and missed their shot. We've met photojournalists who've fallen asleep on the subway, missed their stop, missed the entire assignment. We've even met photojournalists that have fallen asleep at the counter of the coffee shop, drinking coffee to stay awake. But you may be the only photojournalist, Bob, we've ever known who fell asleep while having dinner with John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Can you tell us about that and President Kennedy's good-natured response?
Kennedy had just been elected president, so this was the period when the president-elect is selecting potential cabinet appointees. He was living in his Georgetown residence, and it was cold November, and the world's press was camped outside, freezing, and these limousines would pull up and they'd walk 3 steps inside and come out. And this was what the days were like. It was very monotonous, boring, and what have you, until Saturday morning of that particular week. Pierre Salinger, his press secretary, came out the front door and said, "Gentlemen, we have no interviews today. You can all go home. Nothing's going to happen." Well, the world's press did leave except for 2 people. Jim Atherton of the Associated Press, they wouldn't let him leave, and Bob Gomel of Life, because Life closed on Saturday night and they didn't want to take any chances either. Well, about 1:30 or 2 in the afternoon, Kennedy opened that ground floor window. He knew us by name. He said, "Jim, Bob, come on inside." And inside we went into a den. He had the Army-Navy football game on, and he ordered steaks and baked potato for the 3 of us on a TV tray. And we were watching the game, but I was so exhausted from the week of cold that the warm air in the den, I felt fast asleep. And the next thing I knew, my friend Jim was shaking me awake. He said, "Bob, Navy won, the president's left the room. I think we ought to go outside." And from that point on, whenever Kennedy would see me at a conference, he would point at me. I turned beet red. I never got over it.
Among the 3 subjects that this exhibition covers, President Kennedy, I think, was probably the most difficult for you because you were then assigned unenviably to his funeral. And I think it would be interesting for all of us to hear what that felt like, how you approached it, how you sort of had to get your head straight in order to do your job in the face of that sorrow.
Well, like everybody, I was overwhelmed by the news. And when I was assigned to fly down to Washington to cover the funeral, I kept thinking, what can I do with my imagery that the world will never forget this terrible, dastardly attack? And that thought permeated my brain for the next several days. It affected how I found a back stairwell and crawled up to a higher balcony and looked down on the casket. And at that particular moment, the clouds parted and 3 beams of light came down and hit the casket, and I made an exposure, 1 or 2 frames, and the clouds covered it, never to be seen again. And I thought, I've had help on this particular one. This wasn't by my doing, this was meant to be. And then a little of our personality came through. The next step was, of course, Arlington Cemetery for the burial. Well, the reporter and I were only credentialed for the Capitol, but we saw there were over 60 heads of state in attendance in all these black limousines. And we thought, let's get a limousine and join in the procession. So we did. But when we got to Arlington, the Secret Service was checking credentials. And we thought, oh my goodness. But when we got to the checkpoint, the checker turned out to be the reporter's old professor in journalism at university. He waved us through. And so I got a position with the dignitaries. The press wasn't anywhere near where I was, overlooking Charles de Gaulle and Haile Selassie when they saluted John Kennedy. And that's how it all
You may have
happened.
had a little help on that one, too.
Yes. Divine intervention.
Cassius Clay was considered a long shot to beat the champion Sonny Liston. Clay was a braggart and a loudmouth who would certainly receive his comeuppance once Liston finished him off. But that isn't what happened one night in Miami. You were not only ringside for this historic event, but at the historic celebration after Cassius Clay's victory. What did you think then, and your colleagues as well, what did you think of this loquacious hotshot and his iconic friend, Malcolm X?
I quickly discovered that Ali's braggadocio was simply to build gate. That was not the real Ali. He was a sweet, gentle man. In fact, on the rematch, I had brought my young children, and they even boiled the baby nipples for us. They were just delightful people. He was charming and considerate, and we enjoyed his company very much. But that was not the outside personality that was often portrayed in public.
It was a strategy.
He learned that from, he told me, from Gorgeous George, a wrestler who was ostentatious, and Ali had met him years before and liked the way he performed and copied his routine to a large extent.
And so after the fight and Ali's upset victory, how did you find your way to the after party at the Hampton Hotel?
Well, I just felt like I was part of the party, and wherever he was going, I was going, and nobody said no. So I believe I was the only press man or photographer, except for Malcolm and Howard Bingham, Ali's personal photographer, in the room, and I was certainly the only Caucasian. But that was okay. Nobody hated me. In order to get the picture of Malcolm shooting, I had to stand up on the counter in this luncheonette. I'm quite a bit above, and then there are subsequent pictures after Malcolm made his shot. Ali performed impromptu for the crowd, pretending to be a matador and so forth and so on, and it was quite an eventful evening for us. Of course, later on, we learned what went on in the hotel room that evening. Brown and other people where he had to prove his conversion to the Muslim religion, but that was not something that I was a part of.
No, and the very next day, yes, he announced that his name from then on would be Muhammad Ali. And the third subject that we're exhibiting is the arrival of four lads from Liverpool that were kind of a curious bunch and certainly a flash in the pan, right? You were assigned to cover them, and I want you to tell us about approaching the assignment and specifically how the fandom challenged your assignment and what you had to do in order to get your shots.
Flying down from New York to Miami, where he was due to make his second appearance on Ed Sullivan's Sunday night show, the radio stations in Miami tipped off the arrival time of the Beatles, and the airport was mobbed. The windows were broken and doors were busted, and it was total bedlam down there. When we got to the hotel, the designated hotel, the same thing existed. There were mobs of young people in the hallway trying to bust through the guards and whatnot. And Life had an idea that we would like to do the Beatles in the pool. Well, I realized that was impossible under those circumstances. And we talked to, there was a comedian who was dress rehearsing for the Ed Sullivan show. I think his name was, well, it escapes me, from Myron Cohn, I think. Anyway, I mentioned the problem, and he said he knew a family that lived on one of the islands close by that had a beautiful property and a private swimming pool, and they would be only too happy to accommodate my requests. So the reporter and I convinced the Beatles to do this, and they came with us for a day to this private home. And I remember it well. They one remark that stood out was that they said they had never seen a palm tree before. They had been touring England and Europe for months, and this was the first time they ever saw a palm tree. And they were excited by the sunshine. And when I asked them to get into the pool, they changed clothes. And I remember when they came out, my impression was, these were the whitest Caucasians I have ever seen. They had absolutely no skin color. And the other thing about them was that they were extremely modest and looking for direction. They had no egos or sense of importance. They wanted to know from me what to do, and I told them, go have fun. So immediately, they started cannonballing from the diving board and jumping around and having a ball, and pretty soon they were exhausted and they ended up on the lounge chairs, which is one of the memorable pictures on that occasion. They ate there and whatnot. We also took them to the beach. We were at North Miami Beach, and we thought we could get away with it, but we were soon discovered by some young ladies, and they were very forward, and they got a hold of they got a hold of the Beatles, and they were kissing them and all that. Well, the interesting thing about that particular occasion, I found out many years later, was that one of the ladies who kissed the Beatle, McCartney, went home and told her parents, I kissed the Beatle. And they didn't believe her. She was all of what, 16 or something like that. Well, she lived her life without ever being able to prove her point, and her parents never did believe her. It turned out that she passed away in her late 60s or early 70s. But about that time, one of the networks came to our dwelling in Houston and was photographing, doing an interview on me, and I had a picture of Paul McCartney getting kissed with this girl, and it ran nationally. At this point, the family had moved from Miami somewhere up in the Northwest, and they saw the show. And they said, oh my God, she was telling the truth. After all these years, even though she wasn't there at the time. And they called me, and I sent them prints, of course. But it was an interesting little sidebar story to the Beatle adventure.
Oh, that's wonderful. There's so much to talk about when you're talking about Bob's work, about his innovation and athleticism covering different subjects, the determination and ingenuity. And I encourage everyone to take a look. We've got quite a few archive shows on our website, and you'll get the scope that Bob really shot the essence of the middle of the 20th century. And I wonder, I am necessarily leaving something out by just choosing 3 assignments to talk about. Is there anything that sticks out in your mind about the expanse of your career that you'd like to mention before we take questions?
Interestingly enough, my favorite pictures are not the celebrities we've been talking about. At the very beginning of my assignments with Life, I was sent up to New London or Groton for the return of the first atomic-powered US submarine that circumvented the globe underwater. And there was this little girl in a bonnet, and her father was disembarking from the submarine after having been gone for several months. And 2 sole tears came down her eye. And I have to tell you, I have no idea who she was, but that remains my favorite picture of all time. That little girl with the 2 tears waiting for her dad to embrace her. And to this day, even though I'm long retired, I'm interested in the lifestyle of people and the universality of what's going on. And so my wife and I, Sandy is in the back there hiding, but we travel to places that are pretty remote. Hopefully they haven't been inculcated by Pepsi-Cola and McDonald's just yet, if that's possible. And we look for some sense of humanity in everyday people, as opposed to what I did for a living for all those many years.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing these stories with us. And if anyone has questions, I'll just bring you the microphone. Now, don't be shy.
What was your least favorite photo assignment and why?
Least favorite.
Least favorite.
Don't forget your mic.
I would like to say it was a great moment when I shot a picture and then realized I didn't have film in the camera, but that's not true. It's very hard for me. I don't, nothing comes to mind as least favorite. There were difficulties, of course, but mostly I found a way to overcome them and make something of them. I'm sorry I'm not able to pick on any particular one, but I'm being honest about it. I don't really have a least favorite.
Well, certainly the funeral of President Kennedy was one of the most difficult, yes?
Oh, yeah, but not least favorite.
No.
That was very important to me.
Bob, I'm interested in understanding what kind of direction you got for these Life and the other photo magazine assignments. Were you given, it didn't feel like in your describing these situations that you got a lot of specific direction. You were left largely to your own to determine how to handle the situations?
That's quite true. I can think of next to nothing where I was given specific instruction. In fact, my own rule of thumb was if it was a popular event and there were a lot of press coverage, I would disassemble myself from the pack and find another way to tell the story. But specifically, when I was assigned to do Mantle and Maris's assault on Babe Ruth's home run record, I went ahead and secured a 2,000 millimeter lens and a old Air Force mapping camera and 100-foot rolls of film. And every time Mantle and Maris would get up to, they were getting close in the 50s, the record was 61, I would have to let that motor go at 50 frames a second. And the lab hated me because they had to process all this stuff, but it was my, and we got the home run that mattered.
I'm curious about your first assignment was to do, that was your family that was recognized. Did they own that film then after that, or did you own the film? And it's kind of the second question is, you know, if you work for Life and they send you, who owns what in that, if they're sending you?
I was inspired very early in my professional career that I should ultimately own. So I did not accept a complete staff position, which would have entitled me to medical or a certain camera allowance a month, in return for which I ultimately owned the pictures. And in the long run, I'm happy I did that.
Well, we have another question. Oh, please.
My favorite photograph of JFK, which has sustained me through the pandemic. It's the only photograph where JFK appears to be really alive. It was your photo of JFK at Rice University. What is the story behind that photo?
Well, I was with the president on a tour from Miami all the way up through to aircraft manufacturing factories, culminating in his address at Rice University. So that was about our third or fourth day of traveling with Kennedy. And I just stayed with him. In fact, there's a picture somewhere of me right behind him entering Rice University. I don't know if we have it here, maybe in that, whatever. But it was typical of the way I covered the president, up close and personal. And he and the Secret Service were very accommodated. They knew me, they trusted me, and basically, I was never in any position where I had a request or a situation where I was not welcome.
Thank you. So I have a question that's more general about the industry, and that is, I'm guessing you retired before the entire publishing industry went digital, and that you worked really in analog and film. What is your kind of observation around how everything has evolved to have moved into the digital age? And what impact has it had on this photojournalism from your perspective?
I think the opportunities now are so much greater with the new technologies than they were back in the film days. The sensitivities of the material and all kinds of other things. It's like trying to compare an old-fashioned telephone with your current model cell phone. It's just, I get the New York Times every day, and I marvel at how much they have accomplished with the new technology. And it goes on and on and on, comparative to the limitations we did have back in the earliest days of film and slow lenses, if that answers your question.
Yes, over here, right here. Thank you for being here tonight, and your work is amazing, and how you've captured history is fantastic. I'm curious, in your time with President Kennedy, did you photograph Jacqueline? Did you have interaction with her? And I'm just curious what your perspective of her was.
Well, it was peripheral. I photographed her several occasions, of course, at the White House, and I was also with Kennedy. We were flying somewhere in Air Force One, and he got news that she had a premature birth, and we turned around in midair and went back up to Massachusetts, and I got in the elevator with him and the Secret Service, and he insisted on a priest. That son died a few hours later. I was never in a position where Jacqueline Kennedy, I remember her. She was a newspaper photographer. She had a column in one of the Washington papers at the time before. But my association with her was peripheral. I'm sorry to say, I didn't really have any closeness.
Bob, I have a sort of a question circling back to Michelle's introduction about your shooting then Cassius Clay, soon to be Muhammad Ali. And I was very privileged to accompany Bob 2 years ago back to the Hampton House where that whole scene happened. And for many years, Bob and we used to talk, and he didn't really remember where that was, but the hotel has been restored as a National Historic Site. It was a Green Book hotel, and it was extraordinary to be in that room again, where that photograph was made. But I remember you talking about, I think you were there for several days even before the fight, because Life had a hunch that, of course, again, on deadline, I think the fight was Saturday night, that if Clay Ali won, it would be a big deal. So they wanted to have a cover, and you actually pre-shot Ali to make the cover. And I just was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what it was like to talk to him about, like, well, if you win, you might be on the cover of Life magazine, so let's do some shots.
Yeah, he was very cooperative, and I just approached him and I said, listen, I need to do a photograph as if you win this fight, and how you might react. And he was very cooperative. He smiled. He looked very pleasant. We shipped the film off to Chicago to the printing press on a Thursday, and it was plated, and then the big upset, and it was on the newsstands all over the world on Monday morning. But there is a story that I would love to share with you about Ali and his personality, because I didn't cover it earlier. He loved magic. And when we were in New York together at one point, and we went to see that show about a prior heavyweight champion in the early 1900s, the Great White Hope, we were walking back on 42nd Street, and he loved magic. So we stopped into a magic shop, and he bought, now remember, this is 1960s, he bought a telephone with a coil cord and a bell, and he put it in his pocket. We went back to his hotel, which was the old Taft Hotel, and it must have held about 15 or more people at one time. Elevator operated, the doors closed, and Ali rang the bell in his jacket and pulled out this receiver with a cord and pretended to have an animated conversation, and then put the phone back. We got off at the first express stop. The door closed. We all fell on the carpet laughing because we all knew what those people were thinking.
Bob, it's great to see you. Wanted to ask you, in this photograph of Malcolm X taking a photograph of Muhammad Ali, was Jim Brown in the room, the former great?
Upstairs, I know, but I never saw Jim Brown down there at the counter. He was waiting, I believe, up in the hotel room. I know he was present and documented up there, but not in
And he just passed away in the past couple of months.
no. I photographed him when he was playing football, so I would have recognized him right away.
Right.
Had he been there.
I see. Thank you.
Okay, Sid, you're in charge of time.
Hi, Bob. Did you ever encounter on any of your assignments a subject who wasn't keen on you being there and photographing? You don't have to say who, but if so, how did you handle that and still complete the assignment?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure. Did you ever encounter anyone on your assignments who wasn't keen on being photographed or having you there? And you don't have to say who, but if so, how did you handle that and complete the assignment still?
Somebody who wouldn't allow,
Who didn't want you, who wasn't keen to have a photographer there?
you know. Recently, my wife and I were traveling somewhere, and there was a lady selling something in the street, and she was very shy, and I picked up my camera, and she hid behind another lady, and I chased her around. We went around about 2 or 3 times, and she finally stopped and broke out laughing, and I made her picture. I made it into a game. The trick is to ingratiate yourself with your potential subject matter. And you have to do that with all the charm you've got and hope for the best. You don't always win, but yeah.
We want you all to see the show. So Joe will have the last question, and I hope everybody can stay and enjoy and bother Bob some more.
Ask for me.
Okay.
The picture of Malcolm X taking the photo of Ollie, have you seen that photo?
That's a very good question. As far as I know, it's never been found. I don't know that it's ever turned up.
Bob, thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
here.